My name is Rick Lundskow, and today we're going to create pancakes inside of Cinema 4D. What's unique about this tutorial is that we're going to create one procedural texture, apply it to a bunch of the objects in our scene, and each object is going to look unique based on its position in the scene. So in order to maximize everything that you learn inside this tutorial, you will want to have a basic understanding of how cinema works. Without further ado, let's get started.
First, we're going to start off the tutorial by adding a cube to our scene and add 100 in the X and the Z size and about 10 in the Y parameters. I also like to have ground shading lines on so that we can see the segments that we're going to be adding to our scene. So we're just going to add 3 to our X and 3 to our Z. And we're going to make our cube editable. So go into the lines and we're going to scale down the 4 corners of our cube. I'm going to scale it down to about 70%. We actually want to make sure that the Y-axis is turned off because you don't want it to shrink this side down. You want it to stay the same height all around. Next, we're going to loop select the top and the bottom of our pancake, and we're going to bevel that about 2 centimeters. Now you might be wondering why we're not using a cylinder for this project, as a cylinder is pancake shaped. And the reason for that is we want really nice clean geometry and we want to avoid having triangles in our scene. We could turn up the caps in our cylinder, but when we come to distorting our pancakes, we want to really have some clean lines to be able to work with. So we're just going to delete the cylinder and we're going to continue going on with this cube. So next, just throw it in a subdivision surface, and there we go. There is our pancake. Now, for reference in our pancakes, we want to use something that we want to grab some colors from our pancake image to make it realistic. So this is an image I found off Google. You want to look for images that have the correct white balance because we're going to be selecting from that and we want our image to look right as well. Now I've previously already selected the colors I want just for time purposes, but you'll want to grab a lighter shade in the batter and then a darker of the batter and make note of their RGB values. And then you also want to grab a golden brown, a darker version of the golden brown, and a lighter version of the golden brown. Again, note their RGB values as well. We're going to be creating this texture in 2 different parts. First, we're going to start off with the batter, which is really simple. And then second, we're going to go with the golden brown, which takes a little bit more time and a lot of tweaking. Now, a lot of the times with these textures, I just mess around with different settings, and you might find something that works for you that might be completely different from what I'm doing. But this is my texture workflow in how I create in Cinema. So first, we're just going to create a new material. And just grab a noise, and we're going to be using Naki. Let's scale that up to about 400 or 500%, and we're going to change this over to, instead of using the space of the texture, we're going to be using the world. And I'll illustrate that for you right now. So if you take a look, I have these 4 spheres. We have a simple Paxo texture applied with scaling up, and then the space of the texture is set to texture. Now when I render this out, what you're going to see is that we have some very visible patterns on our spheres. And you'll see that on the back side as well. Now in order to create really quick clones that look completely different from each other, we want to change our texture settings, and all we have to do is change one setting. So I'm just going to duplicate this Paxo, and just to show, to make it evident some of the changes, I'm going to just change this color to blue. And instead of having this set to texture, I'm going to choose our space to world. And then I'm going to drag it on top of our top 2 clones, and let's render that out and see what we got. Now, as you notice, we have a very unique texture applied to both of them. And if we apply it to all 4 of our spheres, you'll notice that all 4 of them have their own distinct characteristics. This guy has an identifying mark here. We have a couple little guys down here. Rotate around the back and you'll see the same thing. So each object is very unique, and that's why we'll use world. Now the problem with using world is if you're going to be using these in an animation, these will look completely different as they're moving in your scene. You don't want it to be changing textures as it's moving, but if you're doing a still image, this works perfectly. So going back to our pancake, we're just going to open up our texture settings and come down here to our gnocchi, and right here I added my 2 batter images. So this is our batter colors. So here's my darker the batter, and then my light version of the batter. You won't notice a whole lot of difference in this scene, but it's just there to give small little hints that there's a texture there. Go ahead and throw that on our pancake. Next, what we want to do is we want to create the top and the bottom of our pancakes. So these nice golden browns. And if we look at our images, I have another image here that we're going to use as a reference. If you look at this guy, you can really notice this unique pattern of these air bubbles getting trapped in as it's cooking. They're lifting off the pan, and then you have the golden browns where the pancake comes into contact with the pan. So we got the main base batter. Now what we want to do is we're going to throw this into a fusion tag, and this is probably my favorite tag in the entire material editor. If we click on it, we have our base layer of our batter at the bottom, and then we have our blend channel up here. If we subtract out the blend channel, we got just our base channel there. But for now, we're going to turn that all the way up, and we're going to go and create some textures in our blend channels. So to start off, we're just going to throw a layer channel into our blend area, and we're going to add a noise. Actually, first off, let's add a color right there and drag that down to the bottom. And we're also going to set our blending mode to multiply so that our top channel is going to be multiplied on top of our batter. Now the reason for this is just to create a more blended texture. You'll see as we come into more results later. But first, we're just going to add a base layer, and we're going to use one of my favorite noises, which is Luca. And inside Luca, we're going to grab the darker version of the golden brown and the lighter version of the golden brown, and just bring that down a little bit just so that it blends a little bit with our batter texture underneath. Next, I want to create a paxo, so we're going to add a noise, come in there. Oh, one thing I forgot is we want to always make sure we're changing this texture to world. So come back out. This is the first thing we're going to do in here is we're going to change this to world. And for our noise, we're going to add a paxo. This time we're going to use the lighter version of our golden brown, and we're going to hit OK. And let's try scaling that down just a tiny bit. And we're also going to bring the high clips down a little bit as well. Now to show you how this looks, I'm actually going to scale this up for a second, and you start noticing these little bit of air pockets that are happening, and we want those to appear so that the batter is showing up underneath. So we're going to scale that back down to about 70%, somewhere in there. And we're going to blend this layer down. Let's set it to multiply. Let's see how that looks. So let's do something a little bit different that I usually don't do. So we got a normal here. We're actually going to duplicate this guy right here, and we're going to come into the bottom version of it, and I'm going to make this white and black. We're going to clamp this down. Now what I'm doing here is I'm creating a mask. So I'm going to mask out this, and we're just going to do this blending mode to layer. So what this is going to allow is it's going to blend the top layer and the bottom layer together. So we're blending the top and the bottom layers a little bit together. But I think I want to make this top one a little bit darker. And let's render that out. So it's looking pretty ugly right now. We'll do some things in a little bit to make it look much better. But I think I want to tweak my scale a little bit. Let's bring the scale up to 149. And the same thing for here. Let's see how that looks. Again, just messing around with the settings, trying to find something that really looks good. Okay, I think that looks good for now. Next, we're going to add another paxo layer. So again, we can just copy this paxo that we have down here on top here. And in our settings, we're just going to change the seed so it gives a little bit of variety to our scene. Going to add the lighter, the golden browns. And we're going to bring this white down quite a bit. I'm going to enlarge this just so you can see what's happening. So we're still having those really nice air pockets right here. And let's actually render that out. Let's see how this looks. So there we go. We got some nice big air pockets in there. And let's set this multiply on top of there and render that out again. There we go. That's there. Much better. Now we got these little ridges where the batter is coming through, but nothing too extreme. Let's duplicate this paxo one last time. And this time we're going to scale it down really small just to get some fine details in there. So let's try like 76%. Let's render that out, see how that looks. Getting a lot smaller air pockets. Let's even go smaller than that. Let's try that. So blend it down by doing multiply, and let's see how those all look together. Let's try one more. Let's change the seed up again this time. Actually, let's go back to the previous one and change the seed again. So each of these have a different seed except for our layer mask and our first base layer of paxo. We're going to come back up here to the top and we're going to pinch this down a little bit more and maybe bring the low clip up a tiny bit as well. Maybe not. Let's see. Let's bring the low clip up a little bit more. Bring the high clip up as well. It's looking much better. Now we got this little pattern right through here. But I'm not liking how it's spread over the entire pancake. So we're going to add another layer mask as well. So we're going to add a shader, another noise, and set this one to, let's go with Naki, and set the texture to world. And we're going to scale it way up, make it a little bit more contrast to this, and drag your Naki underneath the paxo and add it as a layer mask. So let's render that out and let's see how that looks. So there we go. In these lighter areas, that's where this top layer is as well. We're actually going to multiply this down, but we get an idea of where this small little paxo is going to show up. So we're just going to multiply our top layer and take a look at that. So again, it's very subtle differences. We're not going to notice this a whole lot, but as we apply more and more layers into our texture, it's really going to make it pop and look a little bit more realistic. But now I'm going to change the, I went into the color on my top one, and I think I want to make it a little bit darker for extra effect. So if you look closely, you can see we got a little bit more of this paxo happening in the areas that we shaded out. So that pretty much is how I'll texture something in for this top layer of the pancake. Now we're going to work on some more advanced techniques into blending these two together, our top golden brown layer and then also our batter as well. So for this, we're actually going to use a mask, and we're going to create a, let's actually add a layer, come into that layer, and we're going to add a gradient inside of here. Now we want the gradient to be applied in the X and the Y position, or in the, we want to apply the gradient in the 2D V position. And here's where we run into our first problem. What is happening is this texture wants to apply to our top, our edges, and our bottom. And so we really need this texture to apply only to the edges. So the way that we're going to work around this is we're actually going to change our mapping to cylindrical. So we're going to use the 2D V, and we're going to just scale this down. About 50% is where we want our whites to be. So if we click on this little caret to drop down our menu and click on our white, we can set this to 50%. And then we can drag up this bottom here. So it shows right up there. Actually, I think I have my colors swapped. So we're actually going to change these colors. There we go, that's looking better. So we're going to bring this black all the way just to the bottom, or this white just to the bottom here. Bring these two together. What we want to look for is having a nice fine edge that doesn't bleed too much. So what you'll notice here is that we're getting a little bit of blending right here. We want that to be nice and crisp without getting too crisp. So let's just bring those two together. And let's add a little turbulence to this gradient. Something subtle like 2. Maybe bring up the octave a tiny bit. And let's bring the scale up. So the more we bring the scale up, the more it's going to have these nice little ridges in the bottom, and that's looking good right there. So then we'll do the same thing on the right side of our gradient. We'll just grab a white and grab a white and a black and space them out. Make the whites on the outside and the blacks on the inside, making sure that our batter doesn't spill over to the top. And that looks pretty good right there. So next what we want to do is that we have a little bit of batter showing in our Photoshop images on the top. So we're actually going to do that through this mask channel here. So we're going to come into our layer setup, and we're going to add another noise, and you guessed it, we're going to add another paxo. Scale this guy up a little bit, and let's see. Now right now it's set up so that most of our batter is showing the image, so we need to swap these two colors around. And wherever is black is going to show our batter layer. So let's test that out. Maybe a little bit too much. Scale it down a little bit. Let's try 150. All right, that's looking all right. You can choose to mess around with these settings a little bit more, but let's move on. So let's add the blending modes in. So what we want is we want this gradient to appear the most predominant. So we're just going to add a multiply tag to our top noise. So in that way we can see the batter on the side. And let's duplicate this top noise once. Change the seed up a little bit. Maybe add a little bit more octaves, and let's scale it down. Let's see how that looks. And let's see, add it to multiply, maybe make it more transparent. So we have different levels of batter kind of peeking through this image. And that looks great, sweet. Next, let's just add a little bit of a bump, and I'm going to just create a noise. And instead of Poxo, we're actually going to add in a Luca. Bring it down about 70%, set it to world. Actually, we got to do that. Let's double check we have it set up to world in our mask as well. So in the bump channel, we got the noise happening there. Now the problem is this noise is applying to our batter as well. So if we render this out, what you're going to see is we have a pretty nasty noise happening right here. It's a little bit strong up here too, but this is really what I'm looking at right now. So what we can do is we already have this mask gradient set up for our batter here. This guy right here. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to right click on it and we're going to copy that channel. Come down to our bump, and we're going to create a layer. And in that layer, we're going to add a gradient. And just on top of it, we're going to right-click and paste. Now we got to inverse this gradient, so carefully select these guys and swap out the black for white and the white for black. But we don't want this effect to be too intense, so we're going to set it to screen, and then we're going to scale it down a little bit so that the noise affects it very gently. And I'm thinking that looks pretty good there. Just bring down our noise a little bit, about 13%. Now to save time on renders, I don't always recommend this, but what you can do if you're stuck with this default specular is just bring down the fall off a little bit, bring down the width, and let's scale up the inner width and the specular strength as well. That'll give us some quick render times, and we can add an actual reflection in our final render. So the next thing we're going to do is generate UV coordinates for our pancake, because as we start distorting certain things about our pancake, you're going to notice that this is going to make the batter bleed in, and we don't really want that effect. So by duplicating our pancake, we'll hide our first one. We're going to make it editable. So by hitting C, make it editable, and we're going to drag it out. Next, we're going to delete this UVW tag, select both our cube and our texture, then go into tags, generate UVW coordinates. So now instead of saying projection cylinder on here, it's now going into UVW mapping there. This way we can move our object around the scene, rotate it, distort it, and you notice that it's no longer having that batter peek through. But if we distort this and render it out, what you're going to see is that our noise layers that we were putting up before are actually still generating in 3D space. They're not baked down like the gradient is. So that allows us to manipulate this pancake a little bit and create a unique object without distorting the overall quality. So let's grab this guy, and we're actually going to create 3 versions of him. And we'll name it, actually let's undo that and rename our cube to pancake. So now we got 3 different pancakes here, and you can feel free to make more if you want. Now if we render this out, just like our spheres, this is going to have a unique texture set on its own. And one thing I'm still not quite happy with is the batter that's applying down below. So let's fix that real quick. Let's go into our texture, Let's come into our mask layer, and instead of having this voxel, let's actually change it to a Luca. Just the settings, just so that we can get a little bit in there. And let's bring the scale down some. There we go. That's looking much better. Just might need a little bit more batter, but outside of that, I think we're in good shape. Perfect. So there are a couple things that we can do to make these guys unique. And if you own the studio version of Cinema, you will have this little sculpting tag, the sculpting window right here. And so what we can do is we can select one of these guys. Now instead of subdividing it and creating a sculpting tag on our object, we're actually going to use these tools without even subdividing it, because we already have a decent amount of subdivisions. Actually, we're going to add a couple more. So let's select all our pancakes, mesh commands, subdivide, and let's do 2 and smooth subdivisions. So there we go, we got that guy there. Let's turn off the ground shading. And let's grab our knife tool, and if we look back at our pancakes, on this guy down here, we have this nice little line that kind of cuts through where the one side was cooked and then the other side was cooked, and they kind of have this seam happening in the middle there. So we're just going to grab our knife tool and get some settings that look good, maybe bring down the size a little bit. And let's turn on steady stroke, so in that way it's not too drastic. And we're just going to create a little seam along the inside here. And then after that, we're going to add, make it inflate a little bit, just so that they look nice and puffy for our scene. And then finally, the last little step that I take for these pancakes is we're just going to do a grab, scale it way up, and we're going to move this around a little bit. Now, if we had this set to the cylinder projection, if we move this down, the texture would actually appear across here instead of forming with our object. So it allows us to manipulate this a little bit more than if we had stuck with the cylinder projection. Now you could do that to all 3 pancakes, give them each a unique look. We're just going to keep these guys, these other 2, the way that they are now. And we're going to go into setting these up into our final scene. So going back to our startup menu, we're going to hide our top 2 pancakes, and we're going to worry about this guy right here. And we'll do this in 3 different levels. So if you hold down Shift and you drop in a spline wrap, we got that guy there. Now we're going to click on this little icon here to bring up all 4 windows, and in the front panel we're going to zoom in a little bit, create a freehand spline, and let's make this a little bit of a wavy spline. We're going to have a little pancake that's wavy here. Drag the spline right here, and we'll call this P1 or P0 spline. And grabbing our spline wrap, we're going to drop in P0 spline right there. Now you'll notice that it's not quite projecting the way we want it to, so I think we just have to rotate our spline wrap 90 degrees. There we go, just to fit there. And you'll notice this little crinkle in our spline. So if we actually hide our pancake and come back to the spline, we can tweak a few of the settings just to avoid some of those strange areas and make our spline a little bit more uniform. The key is to have simple, smooth transitions in your spline. There we go. That one's looking pretty good. It has a nice little wave to it. So let's hide that guy. Let's go to pancake 2. And let's add another spline wrap into it. Again, we'll probably have to rotate it 90 degrees. Let's go back into our front view, and this time, let's give this one a little bit of a curl to it. So it's going to curl right in here and come like that. It's a little bit of a shaky spline, so let's clean that up. So I'm going to select Spline Soft Interpolation just to give it a nice, clean, smooth look, and just deleting points that I don't like. And that looks about right. Let's rename the spline P.1 spline. And in our spline wrap, we're just going to drop down P.1 spline. So now we got these two pancakes that are fitting right there. One looks puffier than the other. I think that has to do with its fitting. Let's keep the original length of the pancake. Let's see. Maybe come back down to this spline, shrink it down a little bit. And there we go. Maybe rotate this guy around. And stack them like that. And so for this final one, we're going to do the same thing we did before. We'll hide our first two layers. And for this one, we're going to, let's create something let's create a backwards G there. Put a spline wrap in our top pancake, and then rename our spline P.3 or P.2. Drop it into our spline wrap and rotate our spline wrap 90 degrees. And let's choose keep length. That's looking good. Let's turn our other ones on. Let's actually scale that down a little bit. Just rotate that guy on top. Now, if you want to move these guys around, you will not select the pancake. You'll actually select the spline and move and rotate the spline around. So once you got everything to look good there, we're actually going to go into the final part of the render, which is the scene setup. I don't do anything too difficult. All I do is I add in one light and then an HDRI. So we're just going to come in here, and I have the Grayscale Gorilla Light Kit Pro. You can do this with any light that you want, but the one key thing that I always do is I turn my light fall off real high, just so that it gives it a nice even fall off. And then the other thing that I might do is I might change our shadows. Instead of an area light, I'll do shadow map soft. This is on a per render basis. I might change it up depending upon what I'm looking for. But that looks pretty good right there. And then I also like to turn off the illumination so I don't see that light bulb circle there. And let's add a sky object. Now, this part you can find a bunch of different HDRI maps free online. I actually have a few of my favorites. Let's see. in the modern industrial pack. And let's grab this guy. One thing I always do in my HDRIs is I like to come down here to the illumination tab, and I really like how I set up my scene with my soft boxes and all that, and I don't really want the HDRI to overpower those guys at all. So what I'm really looking for is the HDRI to provide just a hint of light and then also be great for reflections as well. So I'll just take the strength in our generate GI and I'll turn that down to 40%, sometimes 30 or 20, and then our saturation down to 30, 20, or 10, depending upon the scene. And we're going to apply that texture to our sky object, put a composting tag onto there, turn it off so we can't see it in the camera. And let's add a camera to our scene. Another thing I like to play around with is these focal lengths. And I like 80 millimeter for a portrait to give a nice photographic look to it there. And let's go into render settings. Same thing, I don't do a whole lot different. I don't do anything too complex for my scenes. I'll just take and I'll add a global illumination, just turn it up to 2.2. And then turn this down to low. And then just for preview purposes, we're going to go to progressive. And just with that, let's not forget to save our scene. And just with that, then I render out and we'll see what we got. One last step that I almost forgot is we're actually going to add in a displacement. So we're just going to grab a displacer, drag it down to the bottom. We're going to double click on this guy right here. We're going to come into our color channel and we're actually going to copy that channel there. Going to create a new material and we're going to paste that right in here. So we essentially have a same exact duplicate as our previous texture using the same exact information, but one thing we're going to do is we're going to actually make this black and white. So by clicking on this little caret here, we're going to come down to filter and then enter the filter. And so in here you'll see we have our fusion tag, but we're going to drag the saturation all the way down. Maybe make a little bit more contrast to it. We can also edit the RGB here, make it a little bit darker. The other thing, actually we have to flip this. Now the reason why we're creating this texture here is so that we can apply it to our displacer. So all our golden brown areas will stand out a little bit more and be a little bit more punchy. So we're going to flip this RGB value here. But then the only problem with doing this is we want this gradient, this inner part of our pancake to appear puffier. So we're actually going to come back into our fusion tag and we're going to flip that gradient. Actually, we have that. Yeah, let's do that. And we're going to move it to the top and change it to screen, and then this bottom guy to normal. So there we go. We have it puffed out in the middle here, and it's going to appear rigid right there. So then in our displacer, we're going to come over here, and in our object settings, we're just going to only puff it up about 0.5, keeping the intensity to centered. And instead of using a custom shader, we're going to use the color channel from one of our textures. And we're just going to drag our new texture onto here, but drop it behind our actual texture. Then select the displacer and drop in that texture tag as well. So now when we apply it to all three of our pancakes, applying that same texture tag into each one, what that allows us to do is use the unique information from each of these pancakes to give it a little bit of a displacement to it. So we'll try rendering it out and see if we can see a difference in here. We may need to up our polys on here, but we may not. We may have just enough information. So if you look closely, you can start seeing a little bit of these areas being puffed up. I'm not too happy with the lack of puffing, so we're going to come back in here and we're just going to add in a little bit more contrast. Let's take a look at our meshes. Those are looking pretty good, but maybe we need to add one more subdivision. So we'll add just one more subdivision, smooth subdivision, and hit OK. And we'll try rendering it out, see what we got. Now that is looking pretty good. You're starting to see a little bit more of the detail happening in our mesh, and it's looking great. So what we're going to do is we're just going to save this out, and we'll call it pancake. And we're going to choose a PSD right in here, and we're going to add in an alpha channel. Now, by choosing a PSD, what it's going to do is it's going to bake our alpha channel right in there as a separate channel for our piece. So that's pretty much it. We're going to render out, and we'll be back with some final touches in Photoshop. We're at the last part of this tutorial, and so I opened up the image in Photoshop, and you'll notice already that I added a few more details than what we last saw. I added the details into these top two pancakes, and then the other thing I did is in sculpting, they have a couple of sculpt brush presets where you can go in and add little craters into this, and I just wanted to add a few little bubbles into the pancakes as well. And then also I increased the displacement on our textures. In the displacer, I just bumped it up. Instead of a 0.5 centimeters, I bumped it up to 0.75. Outside of that, we're looking pretty good. So for this next part, I'm going to show you some of my post-process techniques. So what I first like to do to start off is I like to duplicate this bottom layer twice. And so we'll hide this first one, and we're going to grab this middle layer right here. We're going to go up and apply a Gaussian blur, and right about 1.2 or 1.3 should look good, maybe a little bit more. What we want to do is we want it to hide some of these extra details in there but without blurring it too much. So I think a 1.3 should look good right there. Next, we're going to show this top layer, and we're going to go to Image, Apply Image, and we're going to select the middle layer right down here. And with that, we're going to, for the blending, we're going to choose Subtract. And we're going to subtract out our middle layer down there, and I just input these settings 2 by 128. You'll see this image goes gray. We're just going to change this to linear light. Now what this does, not lighten, we want linear light. Now what this does is it separates our colors from our black and whites, and it gives us just a nice lined layer. So if we go back to normal and we zoom in, you can see some of these lines happening right in our image. So we're going to go and choose linear light again. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this blurred layer. I don't need it, but as soon as I delete it, you'll see that I'm instantly getting stronger lines. And we'll redo and undo that just so you can kind of get an idea of what's happening. And what that does is it allows our render become just a touch sharper, and you don't want it too sharp where it starts looking over processed, but just enough to add a little bit of extra depth into our image. Next, if you selected alpha channel, you'll notice that in our channels over here, we have this one right down here selected as alpha, and we're just going to command click on that, bring our background layer to its own layer, and we're going to mask out the bottom layer. And if you hold down Control and Alt and drag the mask up to the top, you'll get it on the top layer as well. This way it won't apply anything to the background, and we now can create a background inside Photoshop. So let's just go ahead and create a new layer, drag it to the bottom. Let's sample a couple of colors from our scene to use as our background gradient. Let's use a darker version of our golden brown and then a lighter version as well. Select our gradient tool. So you're going to select the gradient tool. We're going to choose a circular gradient. And just from grabbing inside the center and dragging off just off the edge, we got this nice little gradient happening. We may adjust that a little bit later. Actually, let's try making it a little bit darker. That should be good for now. So we're going to duplicate that background layer, and we are going to add a little bit of noise to it just to avoid getting some banding results later. I usually do it about somewhere between a 2 and a 5%. So let's try a 4. And if you zoom in, you'll see a little bit of this noise, and we're just going to reduce the opacity of this layer down a little bit. Somewhere that looks good. Okay. Next up is I like to duplicate my color layer, my layer with all my colors, just so that I don't destroy anything in this next step, and I can come back at a later point if I don't like what I'm doing. And we're just going to dodge and burn some of these areas. So if you hit O on the keyboard, we got our dodge tool. I like to start off with burn. And just with something low, maybe 10%, maybe 2%, depending upon the scene. Yeah, it's probably going to be more like 5%. We're just going to darken in certain areas, give it a little extra shading. And then we're going to go and select the dodge tool. Again, probably something really low, around a 5%. And we're just going to burn in the highlights. And then as a final step, just add a little bit of a curves, give it some final touches. And that concludes this tutorial. I hope you learned something new, whether it's about texturing or modeling or whatever the case is. If you have any questions, hit me up on Instagram, and I'll be glad to answer any questions the best that I can.